The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast in which I, Tylor, someone who have read these books, is kind of upset about how good the second one is, and Greg, a first-time reader, tells me actually it's not that bad, or at least I hope that's your message. Greg, how's it going?
I'm good. Excited to be doing a little reading. As promised from last time we recorded, I ran right upstairs and read right away, which is a good sign. Except it means I read this like a week ago. So now we'll test my memory and my note-taking abilities as we talk tonight.
Well, based on my dungeon mastering, your memory and note-taking abilities are sometimes spot on and sometimes dangerously close, but not right. I'm willing to take
you're out of line,
gamble.
but you're right. So I'll take it.
Well, given that we obviously have nothing important to say, why don't we dive straight into an ill-advised discussion of visual media on a non-visual podcast, which is, of course, the new chapter icon that has appeared in this week, the icon on chapter 13, the traveling stone, or whatever term we want to give for it. This is an interesting image, I think, because it is so dark and because the line work on it is so thin. Other than that, I just want to toss to you and get the first-timer's perspective before we do say anything else about it.
Yeah, I would imagine this one's not going to make the tattoo just because of how delicate it is and that it would be very difficult to get right. Yeah, I think most of all, it was immediately clear to me that this was the stone from the end of the previous Rand chapter, and that generally speaking meant to me, oh, okay, it's more important than maybe, I had first given it credit for, and then that obviously was confirmed as we read. So absolutely how dark it is stands out, and just I would say it was striking to me that we've had frame breaks before, more like the top edge of this one, whereas this one goes entirely off the frame at the bottom, right? So I'm imagining we're seeing a tall column, but we're just seeing the very top of it. And that's not as common as kind of a tree branch pushing out or a loop of a horn or something like that. So to me, deep symbolism time. That means we're dealing with something dark and we're dealing with something that we only scratch the surface on. We're only dealing with the top piece of this very deep thing we're introduced to.
Yeah, I want to highlight two things in addition to that, which I think are really good observations. So the first is that last time we were talking about one of these chapter icons, we highlighted that black and white is not only a light-dark thing, although that certainly is part of it. This is also potentially a Sidar-Sidene thing. And I think the fact that this stone is the first time that Rand has kind of inadvertently channeled, at least it seems, that I think maybe that symbolism makes sense. The other thing here that I found really striking was the way that the damage is kind of indicated on this stone, right? It's clearly extremely old. There are cracks and chips out of it. And then I also think it's just really striking how those cracks are almost thicker lines than a lot of the etching on it. It almost seems to, kind of indicate that like these breaks are deeper than what anyone kind of carved into the stone. I think it's just it's a really well done image in that it encapsulates a lot of things, like you say, stretching out of the frame, the kind of time element of it, just how precise some of the things are. I think it's just really well executed.
Yeah, I'll certainly agree with that. And, just to say it a different way, is that it tells you so much without really revealing anything. And just there's a lot to this story here. The squiggles on it, the etchings are really interesting in that they don't appear to be any kind of recognizable script. This
Yeah.
seems like a pure fantasy thing. So a reminder that while this may be somewhat based on our world or what's familiar, there's a lot here we don't understand. And kind of makes me think about goblin writing and things like that from other
Yeah.
fantasy stories. And we obviously had the writing down in the dungeon at Faldara and things like that. So we know that there's lots of other languages here. So it's interesting to see one.
Yeah, and this may even be, it's worth noting, given the ancientness of it, this may be a representation of the old tongue, that language that we've kind of heard in many phrases before, but never actually seen in world. The last thing I just want to mention about this image, what does it stand for when it's at the beginning of a chapter? Probably one of these stones, or at least one of the worlds that they allow you to get to. Obviously, we'll have a much deeper dive into that later on.
Yeah, I was going to say, I have questions, but I'll save them for now.
I don't have answers for you at this point. So let me avoid any questions you might have by giving a summary of chapter 12, Woven in the Pattern. So chapter 12, we pick up, last time you saw Egwene and Nynaeve's name and immediately said it's a Nynaeve chapter. Oh, I am so thrilled to tell you it is an Egwene chapter, which is much better.
Not to interrupt you, but my first thing is I had said Nynaeve chapter and I had to cross it all out and write Egwene. So my notes visually represent what you're saying. But please give us the summary of our first two chapters.
Yeah, so we pick up with Egwene and Nynaeve, actually in the middle of action that we had previously seen. The arrow has just been shot. There is commotion all over, and they are trying to figure out what is going on. The Merlin briefly meets with them, says they both have the spark and that they have clearly begun channeling already. She especially notes Nynaeve's spark as being especially strong. And Egwene kind of feels during this exchange like she's a tool being evaluated. She doesn't really feel like she's being seen as a person, and they abruptly leave. We then get Nynaeve kind of reassuring Egwene about Rand as they're traveling. We get a lot of the like travel stuff that I kind of yada yada over in descriptions like this. We do get a couple of moments. One where Lan comes to see Nynaeve. They clearly have some sort of argument, and it's clear that that discussion ends with Nynaeve being extremely angry, and then he never comes again. And then we also see that Moraine more or less is ignoring the characters. The one kind of, I think, interesting scene that we get, rather than just travel time, is with Varen talking to the girls. She arrives. She is supposedly there to teach Egwene how to kind of consciously touch the power, how to have a little bit more control over it. And it's clear that she is trying to get Nynaeve to participate in these lessons through various methods of anything between cajoling and blackmailing seems to be her strategy. In this discussion, we get a couple of interesting tidbits about the power and how it is wielded, but we also get Varen both probing for information and seemingly subtly hinting to the girls that she knows that Rand can channel, and potentially even that she knows that he is the Dragon Reborn. We then get a whole bunch of other description of travel, and then cut to a scene once we have arrived at the river that the characters will be taking to Tar Valon. Egwene is asking around, trying to find Moraine. Eventually, she finds Anaya and is told that Moraine left, and Leandrin left, and Varen left. So basically everyone other than the characters in this scene that we know their name are gone. And then Egwene is talking to Anaya about a dream that she has recently had. And we actually don't get a description of the dream until she tells Anaya, but it's about darkness around Rand and a trap that she feels may be springing around him. Anaya's response is, "Oh, you might be a dreamer. We should get that tested when you arrive," and then sends her off to go get on the boat, and apparently she does. And that is the end of chapter 12. So a lot of things happen to Egwene in these chapters, but a lot of them are kind of like the quick scenes that only take a couple of sentences. It's hard to know what exactly to pull out. So I'm curious what for you stood out in this chapter where a lot of different things happen, but not a lot of big things happen.
Yeah, I would say You described it very well. It's like, yep, this is just like a quick set of encounters, right? It reminds me of in a video game. It's like you enter the town. Now get your missions from everybody in the town. And there's not so much missions here, but you do that kind of walk around and just hear what every NPC is saying. And you talk to the guy who's like, the bird stole my jackrabbit or whatever. And, you know, I get skip him. And so it was, I will say, and I think this is as usual, kind of more on me perhaps than Robert Jordan. I'm starting to have a problem where the Aes Sedai all blur together because it's a lot of names and they kind of come and go with these very brief scenes. And so I don't really feel like I develop a picture of them, either, you know, a literal picture. Perhaps if I had seen the show, I would have an actor or something in mind, but or a kind of mental picture of who they are, the kind of type of character. You know, I think Varen, as I recall, is the scholarly one. And Leandrin stands out as the kind of dark side one. But there's a few more like Anaya. I'm like, who? What? Have we met her? And you know, we get told that a bunch of teachers kind of pass through. It's like a nightly duty that somebody comes and checks on them, and sometimes they're named, sometimes they're not, and that's all blurring together. So yeah, I would say not my favorite chapter, but it was fun to get it from Egwene's point of view, and like you said, the Lan naive moment is kind of interesting to view it from somebody who doesn't understand. I mean, it's dramatic irony, it's classic, right? We know more about what's going on there than she does, so that was probably the standout fun bit of the chapter.
Well, from standout fun bits, I say we begin with the standout. Not a whole lot happens in the first 5 pages. What were your thoughts on the departure scene, and in particular the Merlin meeting both Egwene and Nynaeve? I thought that kind of like squaring them up and, you know, getting the sense of them was a really interesting moment for someone at the top to be looking and saying to Nynaeve, like, wow. Seemed to be kind of the impression, at least, of her power.
Yeah, it very much felt like a transition moment. It's like you've been answering to, you know, kind of Moraine, but kind of yourselves. And it's like, nope, you're now in this world and you're going to be answering to the seat. And if you want to do this, you're going to have to do it right and kind of strap in. And then, you know, this is a stray observation, but for some reason, hearing these events this time really brought Anglemar into question for me, because he seemed so desperate to have them stay. And we've certainly seen that before, but I'm like, last time we saw this scene, it read like, I'm a friendly host and I want to do right by you to increase my reputation. And this, it felt like he has a reason for trying to keep them there. And if that's he's afraid of a threat, or if he's, you know, we've seen all these kind of sinister agents, did he need to keep her there for something else? I don't know. And I'm not ready to leap onto he's a bad guy, but it just rang differently this time around.
Yeah, I don't know whether we ever get a canon answer to that, and I think that is a very reasonable thought. I do have a headcanon answer to it, which is that his wife was either threatened or intimidated or whatever by Leandrin, and he probably just has like a freaked out wife who is like, no, keep her here for another day. I need to do whatever, right? I don't know what that, you know, next demand from Leandrin was, but that is my suspicion, is he seems different because he has had a, you know, a desperate wife begging him as a result of Leandrin doing whatever she is doing.
Well, and then the scene with the seed is the real piece then. So what is your read on that? Like you say, she clearly respects the power of Nynaeve, and it was in that way a kind of flip on. We thought it was like Egwene, and sure, Nynaeve can go too to protect her, but it does seem like it's the opposite.
Yeah, I had a kind of moment reading this where I was experiencing it for the first time from the other side. I feel like all of my life I have read this scene and immediately felt like Egwene, right? I'm used to being a relatively young person who is, you know, thinks they have the talent and thinks they are up and coming, but is being evaluated by someone on high, right? Even up to like grad school, right? Like that's what you do. You show up and there's 3 people who decide whether you get your PhD or not. It's really weird. But I now was reading this and thinking, you know what? I now am actually kind of relating to the Merlin here. I now know this moment of being in the classroom and interacting with students and being like, you're actually better at this than I am. I might have the experience, I might have the knowledge, but you've got the talent, you've got it. Like, let's get you where you're going. And so that moment of Egwene feeling like she was evaluated and feeling like a tool, I understand that. I've lived that. But this was the first time I had actually felt like, you know what? It's not actually a bad thing to look at someone and be like, you are going to go somewhere. Let me see if I can harness it in some way. That's more of a compliment than I think Egwene is making it. And that really changed the way I read this scene very much in a different way than any time I had before.
Oh, I wanted to sing like Cats in the Cradle to you or something. It's like you're growing and you're maturing. Which makes sense if you first encountered this as a high schooler, right? And now are very much on the other side of a chunk of life. I'll say a chunk, not half, but we'll do the math later. I guess it wouldn't be half. Or well, let's hope it's not half.
Yeah.
And that's certainly, I think I sometimes underestimate how much my role as a teacher kind of gives me a perspective on young characters, but that relationship. We have a friend who has recently blossomed into a love of YA, and it's like, I don't really, that doesn't work for me. I don't disrespect people who love YA, but it's like, I am not that guy anymore. I'm not like, what can the world hold for these characters? I'm much more interested in these kind of stories about mentorship or about kind of what you do after that, right? Like the next day or what have you. So, I'm with you. I like that perspective.
Well, and I think that's why I enjoy the Wheel of Time so much, is I find so many stories, you see the character blossom and become something, and then the story ends. And so for me, getting 15 books is wonderful because Rand can blossom over 5 books, and then we see what that means. And that's just more exciting to me. I like to see those kind of adult stories of not only what does it mean to become, but what does it mean to be. And this series is long enough. I can guarantee you we'll get at least a little bit of that, no matter how young our characters are at the beginning. That's just how this works.
And I just got to throw in the Star Wars reference. That's why I love Last Jedi, which nobody else seems to, because it's like, what happens at the other end of being the savior and the chosen one? And by no one else likes that, I mean 3 trolls on the internet. But I think it's really an important story to say, if you are the chosen one, like your life just goes on after that moment, and what are you going to be, and what are you going to be after, which is an important part of mythology too.
Yeah, and for me, that is what really stands out in this sequence, right? It's all about, as you're saying, kind of mentorship, the passing of the torch potentially from Moraine to the Amyrlin, and then also how these two characters are seeing that, right? The fact that Egwene and Nynaeve clearly are still having quite a bit of reticence towards these people who are supposed to be their teachers and their mentors. I think that's also something to be keeping an eye on, right? They clearly built some level of trust with Moraine, or at least Egwene did. And now seeing all of these new characters kind of popping in and out, it might be interesting just to keep an eye on how much are Egwene and Nynaeve either softening towards some of these characters, or how much, especially as Nynaeve, kind of keeping up the barriers she's built against all Aes Sedai. We see how thorny that makes her in the next kind of major scene with Varen. I don't really have anything else to say either about the Amyrlin or travel time. I think that kind of leads us to the land scene and the Varen scene as the next 2 big moments. I know you said the land scene stood out a little bit more to you, so why don't you kind of take the first pass at that one?
I mean, I don't even know how much I have to say about it. It was really cool to kind of be in that position of knowing a little more than the narrator. And I think that also shows me Robert Jordan's playing more and more with this. We've always had the kind of limitations of a perspective, which is what this is, but it just feels like, oh, okay, as we make this bigger and we spin around through more characters, we get to have a little more fun with what they know and what they don't know. And that provides a thrill. As for what we actually see, I think it's clear last time we saw these two interacting, it was the gift of the ring. Whatever is said here makes Nynaeve particularly upset. And so I would imagine that it isn't necessarily like a continuation of that conversation. Right? Like giving back the ring doesn't seem like it would upset her. Knowing at the end of the chapter that Lan goes, maybe this is Lan revealing like, we have to go, we have to leave, and you have to stay. And where they already seem to emotionally part in some ways, this could be a real breaking of their, togetherness.
Yeah, I was going to say I had kind of two hypotheses, and that was one of them, right? I think
Yeah.
this might be the parting conversation. The other thing that I thought was, interesting about when this conversation is taking place, you referenced the last conversation that Lan and Nynaeve had where he gave her the ring. Immediately after that was the conversation that Nynaeve and Moraine had. I actually have a suspicion that maybe that is what was brought up here, because that was not a good conversation for Nynaeve. And especially since Moraine seemed to know quite a bit about Nynaeve and her feelings in that conversation, I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of discussion or confrontation about how she learned all of that information, with Lan either telling her or not telling her, whichever one would make her angrier. I'm not sure. So those are my two kind of hypotheses. This is me being on my fifth read through, being like, I can guess about any character's motivation. That's kind of what I've got for this scene, though. I think you're right. It sets up an interesting mystery, what was discussed. It gives us interesting kind of play with who knows what and when. And that's really what this scene does, other than kind of letting us know where that relationship is at. Given that, we get Varen and the most confusing, frustrating, dragging Nynaeve tooth and nail into a practice sequence that then ends in some burning blankets. What were your thoughts about this kind of first training scene we've seen among the Aes Sedai?
Yeah, I mean, my mind naturally went to like Jedi training or even a Hogwarts class or something like that. And, I think it took a kind of similar form where we have an eager student and a not so eager student.
Yeah.
And then as this whole thing unfolds, it I think it was kind of, again, a kind of familiar thing. I'm not going to do it. It's dumb. I can't do it. I'm so angry. Boom. Right.
Yeah.
And it's like the power is going to find its way out of the person. It's just making sure they understand what they're doing. And in that regard, Varen says when she arrives that like the channeling they've done is dangerous. They need to, be playing by the rules essentially, and
Yeah.
she's going to teach them the rules. And then I think we get a clear moment of like, this is what happens when you don't play by the rules or you don't control it.
Well, and I think what's really interesting about that scene is that it does exactly what you're saying. It's like Nynaeve didn't play by the rules and things exploded, but it's also Nynaeve couldn't channel by playing by the rules, but she seemed to be able to doing the opposite of the rules, right? The rules that it seems like Egwene is playing by is empty yourself of all emotions, calm, be the flower. Nynaeve is only able to channel when she gets furious at Varen. And so that difference between kind of hot and cold is really interesting in terms of not only, as you're saying, what are the consequences of going in hot, but should it even be possible to go in hot the way Nynaeve is? It's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, and it also just reminded me, like, is Varen the one who should be doing this? I mean, we haven't seen a lot of the like structure of the Aes Sedai, but it felt like this is a master who can't control their apprentice, right? And so nothing incredibly dangerous or scarring happens, but she kind of first admits like, oh, I had no idea essentially that was possible in what we were doing right now.
Right.
And so I think it's noticeable that they don't seem to have really strong structure to what these lessons are. And I don't know, it reminds me of the Star Wars silliness where, Obi-Wan trains Luke on the Falcon seemingly with whatever was at hand. And then we go to the prequels and it's like, no, these are the exact tools that we run classes on and all this.
Yep.
And it never really made sense to me. It feels like it should be more like this, which is like, no, this is the kind of training you do on the move, and you got to have the training now to get under control. And we're just going to use whatever we can, but we are gonna run some risks.
Yeah, and I think that what we've seen of the Aes Sedai so far seems to suggest independence is something that they really value, right? Moraine seems to have more or less been away from the power structure for the better part of a decade, and there seem to be no consequences whatsoever. So I think that combined with this ad hoc kind of instruction structure, I think tells us all we need to know about kind of how hierarchical that system is, right? The Merlin is clearly on top, but it seems like there's a whole lot of latitude beyond that sort of thing. The other thing I want to mention is you say Varen is probably the worst possible person to be doing this. You're right. But also, I think the thing to keep in mind with Varen is so far we have seen she is never as simple as she appears, right? Even in the conversation with Moraine, she was constantly ducking between, is she oblivious or does she know everything? I think we should be questioning, is Varen being this bad of a teacher on purpose, right? Is she doing it? We see at one point in this scene, she's trying to get information from them about Rand. She's trying to kind of imply and almost blackmail them about him being able to channel. I think there may be something to she's bad at teaching, either to put them off guard, or if she suspected Nynaeve needed to be frustrated or angry, that may actually have been something she was doing on purpose. This may just be me loving Varen and thinking everything she does is 3D chess. But I think we've at least got to consider the fact that the ditzy professor is ditzy on purpose.
Well, and to that list that you just nicely outlined, I will add, I felt like making these lessons the way they are and making sure Nynaeve struggled and Egwene is just fine seemed to be a tactic you would use to sow discord between them, right?
Yeah.
That there is frustration between them on both sides of that. And so that's kind of naturally causing a fissure to crack. It's not going to be dramatic yet, but it does seem like, if you were trying to control these two, then what you do is you separate them and cause a division between them. So I'd add that to the list of potential things. As we move through the other teachers, I didn't bump on a lot of details. I think there was an Alana, is that right?
Yes, and we have sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say who was particularly interested in the boys. So go ahead.
Yes, and I was going to say we've had a couple of mentions of Alana previously. She was one of the Green Aja sisters who traveled with the Merlin, and I think had a couple of brief moments in conversation outside of her quarters. So that is a named Aes Sedai who's come up often enough. Add Alana to the list of people who maybe should be more than just a vague sketch.
Well, and one of the things you just remind me of is it was notable to me as well, where I'm trying to figure out the relationship between these Ajas, between the colors. There seem to be some natural divisions and some rivalries. And it's like, oh, okay, so the training kind of shuffles through all the colors, and it's not Hogwarts houses. It's more like, let's show you each of our perspectives. We'll all put a hand in, and then maybe someday there's a choosing ceremony or a wand or whatever. So that's all really interesting as we start to learn, and that seems to me to be so deliberate. That's not it's not a function of the travel. It's like what they would want their school to be structured with.
Yeah, and as we'll see kind of going forward, Aes Sedai training and what goes into it is really an interesting thing that Robert Jordan has constructed. So it's really interesting to see the early bits of it coming together here. Longtime book readers who are listening, and I know there's at least one. They emailed me. I think this is a kind of a really exciting thing to see, is what is showing up here, and then later on what gets added to it. Be paying attention. I think you're looking at exactly the right details. It's the academic in you. Good job. I appreciate it. I think it's actually really interesting. In your discussion of the Varen scene, you were noting Varen is kind of trying to set herself up both as kind of a mentor figure or potentially manipulate the relationship between Egwene and Nynaeve, and then immediately pieces out, right? All three of the major Aes Sedai names that we know, Moraine, Varen, and Liandrin, are all gone at the end of this chapter. I'm curious whether you have any hypotheses about where they're going, or any thoughts about why all of them chose to abandon seemingly two very important characters here.
So when it's Moraine and Lan, it feels like it has to be something major, right? That they go where something is calling them. And after reading the next chapter, is it that they can sense the trouble that Rand is in and they have to go? I'm not actually leaning that way, because I don't think you break up your characters just to immediately send them back together. So I suspect it is something where they need to head probably to Toman's Head or somewhere else on the continent to deal with kind of a larger scale problem. And so then it feels, actually it felt to me, I'm doing Harry Potter tonight, I guess. I'm not even playing the stupid Harry Potter video game that everybody's talking about.
Yeah. I'm gonna buy a used copy someday, but I ain't giving money to it.
Yeah, no money to JK. Oh, the AV Club had the best review that was like, if you are buying this despite the anti-trans language, then you're gonna get exactly what you deserve. But there's a moment in Harry Potter 3 when there's like a chain of events, and it's like Lupin runs off, and then Severus chases Lupin, or maybe Lupin's chasing the cat first. So, and it feels like that. It's like Moraine and Lan took off to go deal with this. Leandrin, being an agent of chaos and darkness, was like, those are the two I need to worry about. I'm going to go slow them down or stop them or fight them. And then my guess was that Varen saw Leandrin follow and wanted to go warn Moraine that Leandrin was following.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my split take read on it. And to me, it just felt like, hey, Nynaeve and Egwene, maybe you're not as important as you thought you were, which, it may prove to be wrong, but it was that kind of moment. It's like, you're just, maybe you're stored away for now. And so they are not as worried about whatever this crisis is.
Yeah, I think not as important as you thought you were, but also simultaneously more alone than you expected to be. All of their allies are now gone. And so I think it's, both a blessing and a curse, which is a great place to leave these characters as we immediately jump into Rand's head. Before we do, however, we've got the last scene here where Egwene is talking to Anaya about her potentially being a dreamer. We don't get a lot of details about what this would entail or what this power looks like, but we have yet another example of something that seems to be relatively rare or at least relatively old coming back again. What are your thoughts about yet another thing being reintroduced? And was there any kind of hints that were dropped about dreaming that you found especially interesting?
No, because it was about dreaming. I tuned it all out. As we've said, this is my blind spot in literally all books I read. I'm currently reading. I think I mentioned it last week. Chuck Wendig's book about the Wanderers, which is kind of something like The Stand. It's kind of like a post-apoc, and like we cut to dreams. I'm like, nope, snooze fest, move on. So I think anything I pulled from it, it's like, yep, we get it. Darkness coming. Old is new again. Come on. Keep it going, keep it going. So I will admit I'm not a terribly good reader in those moments.
I am fine with that, honestly. There is not a lot of detail here. We get a kind of vague dream about Rand being in trouble. The only thing I will say is if you are looking for a just quick note in your brain, who is who, Anaya is the one who thinks Egwene is a dreamer, is not a bad bookmark for at least a few books until you get a better sketch of that character.
Oh my God. I just love with the series, you can say a few books.
Yeah.
We'll come back and we'll see them again. Okay, cool. Would you please bless me with a summary of chapter 13 from Stone to Stone?
I kind of don't want to after you asked so nicely, but I'll do it for the listeners. So we catch up with Rand. He is waking up and he is not where he started. It appears that they are in seemingly the same area, although in a slightly different spot in it. The stone is there, the same as it was before. Loyal and Hurin and their horses are there, and no one else. Everything appears to be hazy and faded. He wakes Hurin and Loyal. Hurin is freaked out, and Loyal basically says, "Oh, I know what's going on. I read about that stone in a book once," which is the most Loyal reaction to anything ever. Loyal explains that these stones were at one point in kind of ancient history used by Aes Sedai to travel between worlds that he describes as being linked by if. And he, in trying to describe it, gives kind of like the philosophical description of like, if someone's making a decision and they can go two ways, are two worlds created. This is our Robert Jordan version of the multiverse. Hurin then begins to basically freak out. He thinks they can't possibly get back. They don't know what's going on. And he clearly needs someone to take charge and take authority. And Rand, as the supposed Lord, steps in and tries to do that. And clearly he knows he is taking on kind of big responsibility when he does so. Rand then says, hey, we could try to use the portal stone, and he tries to channel. He goes into the flame and void, he feels the light, and nothing happens. Hurin then reveals that he can still smell the dark friends, and so it is decided that they will make their way south following the scent, because A, Rand doesn't think he can probably channel, and B, it seems that he is worried that Loyal will figure out that that is what he is attempting to do. And that is where we leave a quite brief chapter, I think. I don't have a whole lot in my notes to say about it. What was your impression about the introduction of this very different power place thing? I don't know what to call it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly completely unexpected. I think you nicely ended our discussion of the last Rand chapter with like, and what do you think the stone is? I'm like, I don't know, a rock? Leave me alone. Like it just didn't seem that important, which I assume is what Robert Jordan wants of us. And then we pop into this chapter having everything changed, like literally the whole cosmology of this universe. We're like, oh, okay, there's something way bigger going on here. The thing that it is closest to is what we talked about in the first book when they go traveling. I forget what that place is called. The ways. And so it's like, oh, that's right, we are in a space where we have other planes of reality, for lack of a better term, and yet this feels totally different than that and separate from that, as we've seen. My biggest note here is just like more multiverse stories. Like we can't escape these right now, and I know this is from the 80s or what have you, but it is just funny how I'm so over multiverse.
First off, 90s. Second,
90s, sorry.
let me tell you, I was over the multiverse thing before the multiverse thing started. I will say, if your like blind spot in fiction is dreams, mine is time travel paradoxes and multiverses. I hate stories where that is the premise. I am amazed I enjoyed Everything Everywhere All at Once. I don't know how I liked that movie. It overcame my bias. I'll be honest, the worlds of if, or whatever we want to call these right now, do not overcome my bias. It's pretty by the book, what if alternate reality stuff, at least as it's presented here. That doesn't excite me much at all as a reader. I think mostly just because I prefer my hard sci-fi really concrete and my fantasy really loose, and I don't want too many rules in my loose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally fine. And so I would just, where my mind goes is I'm always thinking of comps, and Star Wars now kind of a thing I don't really like, which would make me lose my fandom card with a lot of people, I believe, including your wife. I don't like the world between worlds things that Star Wars has come up with. It was in the animated show Rebels, and it just feels not Star Wars to me. And it's kind of more fantasy. Like that's why I think I expect something like what we're reading here. The other comparison that came to mind, I think because of how they got there and the way it was presented, was the Upside Down from Stranger Things, right? That we, in Stranger Things, it's both literally right beneath their feet, but it's, another plane of reality, not their own, and things have gone wrong there. And so it felt, when they're talking about the way this kind of looks right, but kind of shimmers and bends in weird ways, that's not exactly the Upside Down, but it's kind of a similar feeling as I looked through it. So I did like the language of between the worlds that might be. We have the lines of if. I was like, all right, I dig that. That's pretty cool. That's a fun way to present it. It made me think of, now I'm just referencing movies and shows I watched. I always thought it was silly in the fourth, because there are 4, believe it or not, Indiana Jones movies. The fourth one, they do the weird thing where they say it's not from outer space, it's from the space between spaces. And they do a weird hand gesture every time, like that will make us understand.
Right.
That movie's so bizarre.
It's really bad.
But yeah, so it felt like that. It's like, oh, it's the space between spaces, and I wanted to do the hand gesture into my book. What is then? All right, check. That's all my notes, except for what's then the most exciting is that the villains came this way, right? So Rand is kind of accidentally more on the trail than he thought he was going to be. which is like cool. Now it was like, let's chase them down, like we're the ones who are going to do it, these three, and I'm interested to see these three work together. I like these three characters and I'm curious about that. But then the kind of like, and I was like, yeah, off on an adventure, close the book. And then I think like an hour later I was like, wait a minute, how did they get in? Like, how did they go through? And it was like those questions hadn't crossed my mind of, okay, does that mean they have a channeler? Is this, again, I'm running on the assumption that Padan Fain is being possessed by some more ancient power. Is that an ancient Aes Sedai of some kind that could have channeled the Sidene?
Yep.
To be to use the stone. Yeah, that's interesting to me. I'm curious to see how this is, and it's great to have your characters broken up and then just like really broken up, like totally different planes of existence. And I'll be curious to see if anybody can follow this group there, or if this group has their adventure and just eventually returns. But that uses up my notes.
Honestly, I don't have too much to add to that, other than I actually want to take us back a scene. I think you did a really good job of kind of summing up where are we and what are the mysteries and what are we looking for in future chapters. Well done. I appreciate it. I think, though, I want to give at least a little bit of emphasis to the scene where Hurin basically begins to panic at them being separated from the rest of the group and more or less kind of forces Rand into a leadership role, right? This is the first time he's really kind of taken responsibility in this way and kind of tried to live up to someone seeing him as a lord, even though he doesn't believe he is one and he isn't. What was your thoughts on this scene of Hurin more or less begging Rand to take command?
Yeah, it's a little Joseph Campbell refusal of the call, right? It's like, no, I'm not that guy. It's like, yeah, you are that guy. You're just not that guy yet, right? You're not there yet, but you will get there. And we got hints in the previous Rand chapter about the way lords are slightly different than we might conceive of them in Faldara, right? And the second of command and how rigid that is. It felt like Hurin is very much a product of that world, and so it's not just you need to save us. It's very much like, no, like I have always deferred to who's in command, and now that's you, and you're gonna have to deliver us in some way.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's simultaneously well drawn. I think I can see what Hurin is going through and I can believe it. And it also simultaneously just made me feel just a little bit like icky. Like, no, it's okay for you to not have someone telling you what to do. That's fine. And I know I think you're right. It's trying to show that like rigidness of Shienaran culture and the way that they think about, command. But in doing so, there's just a part of my modern brain that's like, ew, I don't like this. Please stop begging to be controlled. I'm good.
Yeah.
But yeah, other than that, this was a brief chapter. It's mostly here to kind of introduce us to this new power, and then we're in it. We get to see what comes next. So I don't really have a whole lot in addition to that to throw in here. That leaves us next week with another not super short, but about right on par, maybe a touch under 2 chapters. Chapter 14, Wolf Brother, and chapter 15, Kinslayer. Both one-word chapter titles, but also, I think, fairly evocative. Greg, I will let you hypothesize however you would like about what is going to be in those 2 chapters, but you're going to take us out of the episode today.
A fun moment. It does. I think as a reader, I had hoped that the last set of chapters was kind of the real, like, let's take the turn and we're now off on our adventure. And yet I think that got Rand where he needed to be, but now we had to have these other 2, and now Rand somewhere totally new. So it still feels like we're in a transitionary moment. I have converted my reading tracking this year. I'm using an app called Storygraph, where you kind of mark your progress in the books as you go, very similar to Goodreads, except not controlled by Amazon. And so I will note that I was struck that when I entered in the current page number, we are just about at a third of the way already. And so to still feel like we're not fully on our adventure is a bit surprising. But
I hate the first half of this book.
And I think, where we had this week was pretty short and next week is pretty short. It's like, well, we can't get that percentage up this way. So, but you know what? We will get that percentage up, and we'll do it together next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.